Good morning, everyone. And I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Susie Wu. Dr. Wu graduated with a bachelor's in art history from the University of Irvine in 1995, a master's in Asian American Studies in 2002 from USC, and a PhD of distinction in American Studies from Yale in 2009. Dr. Wu has taught American Studies at Cal State Fullerton since 2013 and has received the Outstanding Untenured Faculty Award in Humanities and Social Sciences and the Faculty Advisor of Distinction Awards in 2019. So we'd like to welcome Dr. Susie Wu. Susie?
Hi. Thank you so much. And first of all, thank you so much to Janice for inviting me to come today. I'm really excited to be here. And I don't know about you, but I'm longing for human connection. And so even though we have to do this via Zoom, like I'm really happy that we could all be here together. So thank you to all of you for coming today. I'm going to be talking about my book that I just published last year. And it took me 14 years to write. So this was a huge celebration for me. And I'm really excited to talk to you about it. So I'm going to talk for about maybe 35 minutes and present on the book, and I'm going to share some slides, and then I could open it up to any questions or conversations. So I'm really looking forward to chatting with everybody. And so I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So this is the title of my book. It's called Framed by War, Korean Children and Women at the Crossroads of U.S. Empire. And I wanted to begin with a photograph. So this is one of the very few remaining photographs of my family. And here you have, this is taken in Korea. This is my dad. This is my mom. This is my older sister, and this is my grandmother on my father's side. And this is taken a few years before they came to America. And I was born after in America, but this is one of the few remaining photographs they have left from Korea. And growing up, my parents never talked about the war. I knew that my mom was 7 and that my dad was 14 when the Korean War began. But it wasn't until I was in college and started to ask them more questions that they opened up and told me stories about what happened in the war. My mom told me about how her father, who was a police chief in her town, was dragged from her home while she and her siblings hid in the rafters. And she told me about her younger sister who died of lockjaw. She also told me about her older sister who was taken by North Korean soldiers, and she would never see any of them again. My dad told me about how he spent time on US military bases where American GIs gave him chewing gum and chocolate. He talked about how he would look through the trash can in the evenings and find weathered copies of Life magazine and Look magazine. And he told me this is like when he fell in love with American cars and he fell in love with Elvis. He's a really huge Elvis fan. He has like this very big Elvis collection. And it was in this moment, amidst all of the violence, chaos, and hunger, that his American dream began. And one thing that was made clear through their stories was the life-altering impact of the war. And this project was born from me wanting to learn more about the many others who had survived this war. So I started research for this book in graduate school, where I used to sit in the library stacks and I would try to find anything on Korea, like any books or pamphlets or magazines, newspapers that were published in the United States between 1945, beginning US occupation in South Korea, military occupation, and through the 1960s, so through the war. And one thing that I kept seeing in everything that I saw was the image of Korean children. And there were statistics that marked their health. There were numbers that spoke of their homelessness and hunger. There were photographs of them dressed in miniaturized US military uniforms. And I wondered why it was that the Korean children were so central to US narratives about this particular war. And so it was when I did research in Korea that I visited wartime orphanages, and I came to understand that the questions that I had about Korean children were also about Korean women. And this is how my book came to center upon Korean children and women. For the remainder of my talk, I wanted to share some examples from the book that highlight the arguments that I make in it. And this is my table of contents. But before I do this, I wanted to give some facts about this forgotten war. The war lasted for 3 years between 1950 and 1953, and it's still not technically over. An armistice was signed that stopped the fighting, but not the war. It claimed an estimated 34,000 American, 900,000 Chinese, and over 3 million Korean lives. And the majority of Korean deaths were civilian lives. While technically the United Nations fought in Korea, the United States made up over 90% of all the UN troops. And during the war, the US had dropped 635,000 tons of bombs on the peninsula, which is about the size of Minnesota. And when my parents talk about the war, they talk about how entire cities were wiped off the map, how there wasn't a building left standing after this war. So the devastation, like in all wars, was incredibly severe. US violence in Korea deeply hampered American efforts to promote visions of democracy during the early Cold War. To allay domestic and international criticism, the US military and government made numerous efforts, one of which included the production of imagined family frames that positioned Americans as caregivers of Korean children in need. And in part, this is the topic that I take up in part 1 of the book. And in chapter 1, I look at how US military officials actively put US servicemen in contact with Korean children. So when I looked at the records, this was at the National Archives in Washington, DC, the US military kept these Army chaplain logs. So the chaplains who were part of the units would keep daily logs of the activities of its men. And every day there was some sort of point of contact between the US servicemen and Korean children. So whether they were going to orphanages to deliver donated goods like food or clothing, or there was even scheduled playtime where the men were to go to orphanages to play with the children. And around the holidays, the children always put on these shows for US servicemen. And the US servicemen would also often dress up as Santa Claus and bring gifts to the children. So there was daily interaction between the US servicemen and the Korean children. And these mandated interactions uplifted the spirits of American GIs and gave them purpose in this war. But there were additional reasons for this pairing. The Department of Defense sent cameramen to capture these tender moments and then supplied these images to various news outlets. And here's an example. So there were these newsreels, which I'm sure you all know about. And the first half of this newsreel from 1952 showed images of, US military tanks and jeeps crossing the 38th parallel. It showed planes dropping bombs. And then the second half of this update on the Korean War showed this.
The clothes were collected by the Marine Corps League in many American cities. And don't they go over with these Korean youngsters? With help from friendly American Marines, a new dress goes over just fine.
And so in these newsreels and in a lot of the footage coming from Korea, this pairing of US military might and military humanitarian aid were often paired together. And it was a way to display powerful US war technology and then cover over the destruction caused by these same machines by showing how American GIs cared for Korean children. And I'm going to give you one more example of the kinds of images you'd see coming from Korea to the United States during the war. This little boy, his name is Jimmy Busan, and this image was taken from the Stars and Stripes newspaper, which was the military newspaper at this time. And his parents were killed in the war, and he had found his way onto a train and made his way down to Busan, and he made his way over to the USS Whitehurst, which was a naval ship. And the US Marines took him on as a mascot, and they created this uniform for him. So he had this miniature military Navy uniform, and the Department of Defense came on board and filmed him. And they created kind of this short film that showed him scrubbing the deck. It showed him presenting his independence card with his name. He was nicknamed Jimmy Busan by the members aboard the ship. And at the very end of the film, this is a clip from the very end of the film that shows him saluting in front of the American flag. And then these images actually made their way to the United States. And this is a cartoon series by Stokely Allen, who was a popular cartoonist during World War II and into the Korean War. And he started to create this series called Keen Teens. And he would highlight really exceptional teenagers in the United States who were doing really industrious things. So he would sometimes highlighted this one girl named Donna Markser, who worked in the fashion pages of the Miami newspaper. And alongside these American teens, he also created a image of Jimmy Busan. And in his cartoon, he talked about how Jimmy Busan learned English very quickly and how he was a model American citizen, even though he lived in Korea. And you could see here that the images that he used were images that he took directly from the Pacific Stars and Stripes. You see here the Department of Defense, kind of the same salute that you see here. And so these images kind of made their way from the military over to the general public in the United States. And so you see these images, and again, these are just a couple of the kinds of examples that you see of children being presented in the United States at this time. In chapter 2, I look at how average American civilians were also positioned as rescuers of American children. And I do this in part by looking at the American Korean Foundation's sponsored Korean Children's Choir. In 1954, 25 Korean children between the ages of 6 and 12 toured 50 American cities and sang to sold-out audiences. They performed at the White House. They were on TV. They were on that show, Name That Tune. They also had a record here with Urania Records, and this is also intended to help with fundraising efforts to help recovery in post-war Korea. And the choir children were incredibly popular in Korea as well. President Syngman Rhee, who was the president of South Korea, felt that unlike waif imagery that circulated during the war, the choir promoted images of Korean resilience, democracy, and potential for eventual independence. And the choir goes on to raise over $10 million for post-war recovery. And during the tour, it was continually emphasized in US media that these children were double orphans, meaning that they had lost both their mother and their father in the war. And many Americans actually tried to adopt them, but were not able to because there were no protocols put in place for transnational adoptions at this time. In part 2 of the book, I look at how these imagined international families became actual families. And I examined the work of US missionaries and other transnational adoption advocates who pushed for permanent adoption laws. 2 of the missionaries that I examine are Harry and Bertha Halt. So you see them here. This is Harry and this is Bertha. They were fervent Christians who spoke publicly and often about the plight of mixed-race children in Korea. And in 1955, the Halts adopted 8 mixed-race children. And in 1956, they established the Halt Adoption Program. Halts worked closely with President Rhee, and President Rhee in 1953 ordered a directive. And in this directive, he said that all half American children, I'm putting that in quotes because this was his language, should go to the quote unquote land of their fathers. And so President Rhee began this program where he wanted to remove the mixed race children and send them to the United States. And the confluence of these efforts of various missionaries like Harry Halt and Bertha Halt, and then this mandate by President Rhee, opened the path to adoptions from Korea to the United States. And between 1953 and 1965, over 6,000 Korean adoptees came to the US. And while in the 1950s, an estimated 70% of adoptees from Korea were of mixed race parentage, US media centered primarily on full-blooded Korean children when sharing news of these overseas adoptions. So I'm just going to show you an example of some of the media coverage of these adoptions. This is Ri Kang-yong, and you see him here. And during the war, Ri Kang-yong was used in war relief photos and war relief projects. And so you see his image there. And then a few years later, he is adopted. And he's adopted by this American widow. Sorry, I'm just seeing the chat for the first time right now. What happened to Jimmy Busan after the war was over? I actually don't know what happened with Jimmy Busan. I know that the men really loved this child, and they raised so much money for him to help him, but I haven't been able to follow what happened to him afterwards. I wish I knew. So thank you for the question. So here, back to Ri Kang-yong, you see him here, and he appeared in relief posters during the war, and then he was adopted in 1956. And the image that I'm showing you here is from Life magazine. And here you see him, he was adopted by a white American widow that you see here. And in Life magazine, he is wearing a gingham shirt. This shows him on his first day in America. He's wearing a gingham shirt, and he's doing all these kind of American things. He's talking on the telephone, he's watching TV, he's writing a carousel. And these kinds of narratives that appeared across US media positioned adoptions from Korea as American rescue, which in turn supported broader US Cold War efforts to portray the US as a racial democracy, where white Americans loved Korean children enough to make them family. And I wanted to show you an illustration that was drawn by one of the adoptive mothers. You see here how ideas shaped, you see how these model ideas of the model Korean child being rescued by Americans was then adopted by parents who would adopt these children from Korea, and how it shaped their views about what they were doing in terms of these adoptions. So here's an illustration from a woman who wrote to President Rhee and to Francesca Donner, who was President Syngman Rhee's wife. And this woman had adopted 2 mixed race children from Korea. So you see here the children arrive via stork from Korea to America. And you know, what this narrative of children arriving by stork was a common narrative at the time. And what this did is it helped to erase the fact that the parents, the birth parents of these children, were likely still alive. The US military father and the Korean birth mother were still alive, and it complicated the narrative around these adoptions. And so the story of the stork was often adopted, and you would see this frequently in media. You would see it discussed by Halt, and you see it here in the illustration drawn by this mother. And it shows how the children, when they arrive, they complete the nuclear family. Here's the mother, the father, and the son and the daughter. And these 2 children were actually siblings. And it also shows the abundance and security of the American family. And it's hard to see here, but here in this great drawing, she actually lists all the things that are part of her home. So she talks about her home. She talks about how she has a house and chickens. She even talks about how she has a bomb shelter. So it's very Cold War, 1950s. And then at the bottom, she goes on to describe that her house is actually on a plot of land that was part of the quote unquote Civil War woods that used to be a part of the underground used by slaves to escape to Canada. And the illustration reflects how public narratives about Korean adoptions that are circulating at this time informed Americans who adopted, and how many came to understand their action of adopting from Korea as a reflection not only of themselves as rescuers, but also of the United States more broadly. But narratives like these often supplanted the trauma experienced by these children. And when you look at case studies, I looked at various case studies of adoptions that are located at the University of Minnesota in these social welfare archives. And if you look at the individual case studies, you hear other kinds of stories about children who are chanting repeatedly that they want to go home, about children who cried uncontrollably, about a child who refused to eat rice and this was interpreted as a sign of adjustment as opposed to a possible sign of homesickness. And in these ways, stories about model Korean adoptees that circulated at this time didn't allow for the loss and trauma that was experienced by many of these children. And in the final part of the book, rather than look at the families that were produced, I consider the families that were broken apart, at the Koreans who lay permanently outside of acceptable family frames. In chapter 5, I examine how American missionaries and social workers often coerced Korean mothers to give up their mixed-race children. So in the records, I found that there were missionaries who would bring along Korean translators, and they would try to identify a mixed-race child on a US military base. They would follow the child home and try and convince the birth mother to relinquish their child for adoption. And sometimes they would bring photographs of happily placed mixed race children in America, and they would try to explain to the mothers that, these children would lead better lives. But many of these women did not want to relinquish their children, and they tried to hold on to them, even though there was extreme discrimination against mixed race children in Korea. So you hear stories about mothers who dyed the light colored hair of their children darker to try and disguise the children so that they could try and hold on to them. And the women would often try to hide their children, but there often came a point when they could no longer raise their children. And by this point, the children were often 8 to 10 years old. And it's at that point that the mothers relinquished the children for adoption. And because the children were so much older, it made separation that much harder for both the child and the mother. And this effort to try and remove mixed race children and place them in the United States was something that continued through the 1950s and into the 1960s. And so this chapter also examines how mixed race children had to undergo US racial identifying processes in South Korea in order to uphold the Black-white color line in the United States. So since these children were slated for adoption, this process of trying to identify if they were Korean white or Korean Black was a project that was undertaken in Korea. So I'm just going to show you one of the reports. Here's an example of a child report from Halt agency. And if you look here, there's a spot for the administrator to describe the child's skin color, whether the skin color was brown, dark brown, black, the complexion here, medium or fair, and a comparison to the picture. Is the child darker than the picture or lighter than the picture that's attached? There are these areas where the administrator could quickly mark whether the child's hair color was blonde, black, light brown, brown, dark brown, red, and the texture of the hair, whether it was straight, wavy, or curly. They also had areas here where they could mark the color of the child's eyes. And administrators were instructed to inspect the nail beds and scrotums of infants to determine what color the child would become when they were older. And these invasive US racializing practices were brought to and implemented in Korea to assure that Korean white children were placed with white couples and that Korean Black children were placed with Black American couples. And even today, mixed race peoples in Korea are still stigmatized. In the 1960s, there were some efforts to create integrated schools for the mixed race children who remained in Korea, but many of them remained outcasts into adulthood. In the final chapter, I center upon Korean women. And if you look here, this is from Life magazine in 1951. So this is when the war is still going on. And the woman that you see here, this is Lee Young-soon. And she comes to the United States in 1951. And she's nicknamed Blue because US servicemen would ask her what her name was, and she was too shy to respond. And she wore a blue sweater, so the men nicknamed her Blue. And she met her husband, Johnny, who you see here, there's Johnny, in 1949. And she met him when she worked as a communications supervisor for the US Army in Seoul. And if you look at the Life magazine coverage of this, the story was very much about international exchange. You see here that her Korean mother and father sent Johnny's parents, Korean hanboks or Korean clothing to try out. And so the story was very much about international exchange. You see here that Lee Young is learning how to cook Johnny's favorite Carolina style gravy from his mother. And so during the war, Korean brides were a novelty. And like model Korean adoptees, they carried the potential to communicate Cold War narratives of internationalist exchange. And there weren't very many brides coming to the United States during the war. Between 1950 and 1953, there were about 96 Korean brides who came to the US. But after the war, the figure of the Korean bride became more fraught. Korea remained divided in 1953. There were still over 70,000 US servicemen stationed there. And what all of this meant was that this immigration of Korean women was going to continue. And by 1970, there were 14,000 Korean military brides in the United States. And today there are over 100,000 Korean military brides. So further complicating the image of Korean military brides in the 1950s and 1960s was that these women were imagined to be connected to US militarized prostitution in South Korea. So in this chapter, I start by examining how prostitution was regulated by US and South Korean militaries. I also look at the USO bride schools that opened up in the 1960s in Korea to teach Korean brides how to cook American food and wear American fashions. And in the second half of the chapter, I come back to the United States to look at how the US media avoided the topic of Korean military brides for all of these reasons, and by focusing instead upon safer versions of Asian women. So I wanted to share one of these safer versions. This is the Kim sisters, and it was actually two sisters and a cousin. So this person here, this is Mia, she's a cousin, and this is Aija, and this is Sue, and these two are sisters. But I think like for entertainment purposes, they couldn't say like the Kim sisters and their cousin. So they just called them the Kim sisters. And these children actually started singing for US troops during the war. So they were really young when they started to sing for US troops. And a US agent discovers them in Korea and brings them to Las Vegas in 1959. And by 1959, they were in their late teens and early 20s. And they were a huge hit. They appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show 25 times. They performed in Las Vegas at the Thunderbird. And they then, had all these televised appearances. And they were one of the Ed Sullivan Show, they were the top 10 most frequent acts on the Ed Sullivan Show. So they were really, really popular. And so I'm just going to show you a bit of their performance. I wish I could show you more, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you the small bit of a performance that they gave in the 1960s on the show Hollywood Palace. And in the beginning, Milton Berle, who was the host of this show, he introduces them as the multi-talented sisters who could play 20 instruments. That's how he introduces them. So we'll just take a look here. All right, I wish I could show you more. So they're playing the marimba here, but they also played the bagpipes. I mean, they played all these different instruments, and this gives you a taste of their kind of stage performances that they gave at this time. And in the media, in addition to being described as these multi-talented sisters, they were also being described as being very innocent, virginal sisters. So one interviewer asked Sukja, who was the oldest, what do you do when the stage door Johnnies come and ask you out after the shows? And she tells the reporter that tells the men, well, I can't come unless I bring my little sisters. And then they usually leave her alone. And so in these popular constructions of who these women were, it was constantly reiterated that they were innocent, that they didn't date, and that they were very like traditional Korean in that particular sense. And here they are in Life magazine. And sometimes in some of the images that you see, they were presented in a way that was kind of similar to Korean adoptees. Here they are, they always had their signature ponytails. Here they are watching television, but then it was juxtaposed against their screen persona or their stage persona, they wore all this makeup. They often wore their Korean hanboks, their traditional hanboks, which are really billowy, but then they would often change or even strip down to where they were wearing tighter dresses or short dresses underneath the Korean hanboks. In 1967, all three women were married to white men, and they faded from the spotlight. Part of their popularity relied upon the script of the Virginal Sister Act, and this could no longer be sustained once they interracially married white men. And for all of that, this is intentionally blank. For all of the images that Americans produced of Korean children and women, there are many more stories that unfolded outside of the frame. I wanted to end with one of these images that we can't see. When conducting research, I came across many photographs that could not be published. In one case file was a photograph of a Korean mother and her 12-year-old child. A boy whose Black American GI father had started the process of adopting him, but ultimately wasn't able to. Social welfare workers were searching for another quote unquote suitable Negro couple to adopt the child, even though the Korean birth mother told the agency that she didn't want to send her son to anyone but his biological father. And I'm just going to read a few sentences from the book in closing where I describe this photograph. The child sits awkwardly on his mother's lap in front of a backdrop of painted flowers. They wear their best clothes, the mother in a humbook and the boy in a sweater and coveralls. She stares directly at the camera and he looks off to the side. Neither smile. The studio setting suggests that this marked some kind of an occasion, but the deep concern on both of their faces intimate that it was not a happy one. Did this photo mark the last time they would see one another? Was the photo taken as a keepsake for the mother to remember him by? The photograph could not contain the weight of circumstances that surrounded them, from the absent father to the non-home setting, to the quiet stillness, to the deep sadness. The picture was missing all of the expected markers of a family photograph. It was a broken family frame. And these are the kinds of unseen images that I feel are important for us to do the work of imagining. They remind us that it was through the Korean War that violence and humanitarianism came to support one another. US bombs created victims in need of rescue, and US aid provided cover for ongoing American intervention. And my hope with this book is to make transparent how it was that violence and care came together to further US aims, and to unravel this pairing so that empire has nowhere to hide. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Susie. As I understand now, you would like to open the floor to questions.
Sure.
Time for us.
Yeah,
If you have questions, can you please raise your hands and we'll acknowledge you. So I have a question, and
yeah.
it's not going to be very well framed. I'm sorry to say, but so thank you for the synopsis and your very last your closing remarks, and how your book hopes to show or to illustrate how the violence and care came together.
Mm-hmm.
It's fairly clear that we saw how things were manipulated by, I guess, by the U.S. in terms of the story of adoption and orphans.
Mm-hmm.
And what lesson do you think we should learn from this experience? Because obviously we didn't learn this in Vietnam.
Right.
So what would you hope would be the lesson?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, one of the things that I didn't expect to find was that, the Korean War is the first hot war of the Cold War era. So this is America's first war after World War II. And the strategy shifted in concert with American Cold War needs. So people really criticized the US internationally and domestically when the US entered what was technically a civil war in Korea. And so the US did have a narrative that they needed to kind of spin up to, allay concerns that people had. And children became very central to this, as I tried to show in that first chapter. But one thing that I saw was that bringing US servicemen together with Korean children is something that you'll see again and again. You see it in Vietnam. You see it even in Afghanistan. I remember, I don't know if any of you have listened to the podcast Serial. I don't know if anyone, the second season of Serial covers the US defector Bob Bergdahl, who he was a US serviceman who defected from the military in Afghanistan. And they interview a lot of the people in his troop. And one man said, I don't know what we were doing in Afghanistan. I spent more time delivering crayons to schools than I did in combat. And when I hear things like that, it makes me think about how, war is incredibly violent, and it has been interesting to me how the role of US servicemen has since now come to include all this interaction with children, which I don't think is a bad thing. But I think that if that narrative is being used to cover over certain realities of what the US military is doing abroad, then I see it being complicated. And I think that it brings up this question of, the role of US military abroad. I think it complicates what the US military is supposed to be doing. And I really think that it's in Korea that for the first time you see how US servicemen are really asked to, you know, be in contact and have these relationships with these children. And in Korea, the men, so many men lost their hearts to these children. They gave them everything that they could. They started to have the Korean children live in their barracks. You know, they wanted to take care of them, and that, you know, they would have these Korean boy mascots was a very common interaction that you'd see in the Korean War. And so these men cared very deeply for these children. And I think that my concern comes in when it's being spun in the US military, when that relationship is being highlighted so much so that it hides the other things that are going on, that are, you know, yeah. So I think that would be one of my concerns.
We have Rich Eaton.
Yeah, I was stationed in Korea
Yeah.
in the 60s, and I can recall having one of these contacts. There was three of us GIs and a South Korean naval petty officer, and we took a Jeep from the pool, and we're cruising in the, went over and visited. I guess there's a gigantic statue of the Buddha. And we went over there and visited, and then we're walking, we walked around a little bit, and then we saw a bunch of Korean kids who looked like they're all mixed race, and they were standing over one of their young ones. And so we went over and looked, and it was obviously mixed race Korean child, and he had killed himself. He was about 10 or 11 years old. And of course, our Korean companion, he talked to the kids, and he said he just the other kids, and he said he had no family anymore. His mother had abandoned him and stuff. So I brought home to us. I recall that. That was like, it was tough.
Yeah, it's absolutely heartbreaking. And when I see the notes by social workers, because the social workers who are in Korea would often write notes about, you know, how mixed race children were being treated, and they were completely ostracized. So in Korea, it follows a patrilineal line. So the family register always follows the father. So the father is the head of the family. And in order to have like citizenship or to be recognized by the state as a person in Korea, you have to follow the father's line. But these children were born out of wedlock, and the American father was not a Korean father. And so therefore they were actually stateless. So they were not protected by the state. But in addition to that, they faced so much discrimination. People would spit on them, you know, other kids would throw things at them. They were physically abused by the public, and they were, you know, viewed as complete outcasts. And so the strain upon those children was really severe. And that story is, I mean, that is really, really heart-wrenching. And it goes to show, I think, just how bad, how, you know, the discrimination was so severe through the 60s. And I think even to today, I don't think it's quite as severe today, but it's definitely, it's taking a lot of time to incorporate and include mixed race people in Korea.
So I wanted to ask you about the legacy of the Japanese occupation of Korea. So those years between 1945 and 50 between the wars, and in particular about the so-called comfort women that the Japanese used. And I'm wondering if they played a role in your research, if you saw any effects there in when you looked at the role of women in Korea.
Yeah, that is such a great question. And I do. So, you know, Japan officially occupies Korea from 1910 to 1945. And then it was during Japan's war with Manchuria, I think in the 30s, that they began to use comfort women. And so they took about 11,000 Korean women, some as young as, you know, 12, 13 years old, and forced them into sexual servitude with Japanese military servicemen. So that history, one of the things that I talk about in my final chapter when I think about the women, is that these overlapping imperial histories, or these overlapping foreign military histories that happened in Korea. So first with Japan and then with the United States, it actually, the history of the comfort woman becomes the foundation, which almost, in my view, kind of opens up, makes it somehow okay for US militarized prostitution to take place in South Korea. And so one of the arguments that, and there, since then, you know, comfort women and women who were conscripted as prostitutes under US military occupation in South Korea have since come out and protested. And they protest together in the sense that, and the argument that they're making is that the South Korean government did not protect them enough and did not protect them. And instead, they told them things like, you are being patriots for your country by offering these kinds of services to foreign military. And the women are now coming out and fighting or looking for apologies from the South Korean government. They haven't asked for an apology from the US government or the US military, but this is definitely, in terms of Korean understanding, the history of comfort woman is definitely connected to militarized prostitution that was established starting in 1950s, I would say, really during the war for US servicemen. And so those connections are definitely, I think, definitely there. And in fact, many of the women who ended up becoming prostitutes for US military servicemen were comfort women before. And these women were ostracized, even though it was no fault of their own that they were forced into this life. In Korean society, these women were also viewed as outcasts, even though it wasn't their fault that these things had happened. So there's definitely overlap in terms of the actual women, but also in terms of like broader understanding of how the South Korean government didn't do enough to protect these women. So it's a really great question.
I have a question. Did you follow any of the families after the children were adopted in the US? Because I was just wondering how well they adjusted. And, you know, back in the 50s, there was still a lot of discrimination against Asians. So even though they had a white parents, did you follow that at all?
Yeah, I did. So in the case study, so the International Social Services was the primary social welfare organization that helped to kind of settle these children once they came to the United States. And so they have case study files that follow these children over multiple years. And there are a couple things that I found really interesting. One is that many of these children, from the social worker's perspective, it was better for these children to live in areas where there weren't many Asian American people living. So for example, one social worker said, it's probably not a good idea that they go to Seattle because there is a sizable Asian American population. There's greater discrimination against Asians. And so they thought it was best for these children to go to primarily white communities and live there. Now, if you trace how these children did, a lot of them felt this extreme pressure to become as white American as they could be. And many of them did struggle with, you know, identity issues later on and felt like they never quite fit in. They were always viewed as different. And recently, a lot of Korean adoptees, even though these aren't the children who came to the United States in the 1950s, a lot of them are now, there's like a new critical adoption studies where adoptees themselves are creating documentary films. There's a really great film called First Person Plural. I'll write it in the chat. It's really, really incredible, but to show the perspective of what it's like to be a Korean adoptee growing up in a primarily white community. And I actually, this project didn't start out the way that I had intentionally wanted to conduct oral histories and interviews with Korean adoptees who came to the United States in the 50s and 60s. And I actually found one of the children who appeared in the media productions. And I actually received a phone call from his wife. And I sent him a letter to say that I was interested in interviewing him. And his wife called me, a white American woman. And she said, I just wanted to thank you for your letter, but I want to let you know you're probably not going to hear from my husband because it was such a painful part of his experience and he doesn't even talk to me about it. And so I wanted to let you know you're probably not going to hear from him. And I think hearing that story and also thinking about how my parents never talked to me about the war because it was so traumatic until I was much older. I thought that, you know, there's so much about this history that I didn't understand, and that maybe it wasn't right for me to ask them to share these deeply personal stories. So I actually shifted, you know, the topic was the same, but my approach became very different after talking to the spouse of one of the adoptees. And I think that on the whole, from everything that I found in case studies anyway, it shows that they had a quite difficult time. And some of their adoptive parents didn't want them to marry a white person. So there was a father, a white adoptive father, who said, my Korean adopted daughter, I don't want her marrying someone who's white. She should marry someone who's Korean, because even though he believed in adopting her, he didn't believe in interracial marriage. And so that's one case. You know, there are many different other cases where the parents were incredibly, you know, very racially liberal, and all the way through. But there were some, you know, there are these moments where you could see how you can imagine from the child's perspective how that causes all kinds of pressure and tension. So, and then there were various psychological studies that were done on Korean adoptees in the 1970s, and it shows a variety of things. Some say that they were well adjusted, and others say that they felt like they never belonged, and many of these families who adopted also had biological children who were biologically white, and then they had the Korean child. So I'm going to type in the documentary, but it's available through Cal State Fullerton's Pollock Library. It's available, I think, on Canopy, by Deanne Borche Lim. This is probably my favorite one because it shows what her life was like in America. And then she actually goes back to Korea to find her mother, her birth mother. And it's really illuminating for a lot of reasons, and it's really painful to see, but it's a really great documentary if you're interested. And we all have access to it for free through Pollock Library.
We have a question in the chat from Sue Beatty. Were there any mixed race children during the Japanese occupation of Korea during and pre-World War II?
Yeah, thank you, Sue. That's such a great question. And yes, there were a lot, actually. There were many, many mixed race children. They called them occupation babies in Japan. So even during World War II, and then during US military occupation in Japan, so after World War II. So from 1945 into the 1950s, there was a very sizable mixed race population. And interestingly, the many of the parents, the birth mother and father, US military father, Japanese woman, many of them actually stayed together. And that's because, in part, the rules for US servicemen in Japan were different than in Korea. So Korea, it was a wartime situation, but in Japan, there were many US servicemen who were stationed in Japan and then decided to live there. And so you see more frequently families that stay together. So they have a mixed race child, and then the military father and the Japanese woman oftentimes stayed together. That's what I saw a lot in the records. There were definitely a lot of Japanese mixed race children who were adopted by American families. You see a large proportion there too, but probably not at the same scale as adoptions of Korean mixed race children. And I think that's because of the narrative that was constructed around mixed race children from Korea, and about how the situation was so desperate for them in Korea, that Americans were very eager to actually adopt mixed race children, which in the 1950s is a really big deal if we think about race, you know, and think about civil rights and about the rarity of interracial families in the United States in the 1950s. It was really striking to me to see how many white parents wanted to specifically adopt a mixed race child. Now, they often said that they wanted a child mixed with white. They would often say because they wanted the child to look at least a little bit possibly like them. So there were, you know, it was complicated, but still the idea that so many American couples were open to adopting a mixed race child, or even a Korean child at this time, was, I think, really interesting, which is really interesting. Oh, and I'm sorry, Sue, I just saw this. I meant mixed Korean Japanese children. There were a lot because of Japanese occupation of Korea. But the thing that's interesting is that the ethnic, if it was Korean Japanese or even Korean Chinese mixture, they could pass as Korean. And so they weren't viewed as the fact of their mixture could actually be hidden. And so that handicapped children survey report that I had mentioned before, the socially handicapped children specifically said that this does not include Korean Japanese mixed race or Korean or ethnically raised or Korean Chinese mixed race. It only counted Korean white and Korean black mixed race children as the ones who were socially handicapped, who were a problem that needed to be addressed. And I think because they could hide their mixture, it was much easier to hide that mixture. It wasn't condoned, but it was because of the Asian mixture, it was easier to kind of hide that information, which many people did. That's a great question.
Does Korea have kind of a class system? Not officially, but otherwise, is there a hierarchy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's not a class system like England. So it's not quite like that, but there definitely is a class system in terms of who you marry and how you marry someone who is of this similar station as you. But most importantly, I think class is definitely a factor. If you are someone from a lower class, it is assumed that you will always be of that lower class, and your chances of moving up is actually quite difficult. But most important in Korea, because of at this particular time anyway, because of the Confucian practices, the importance of bloodline was incredibly important. So to have the same family bloodline was something that Koreans felt very strongly about. And this is why stranger adoptions or adoptions of children who are not related by blood is not typical in Korea. And even to this day, there are these efforts to promote domestic adoption as opposed to sending Korean children abroad. Like there are over 150,000 Korean adoptees living in the United States today, over 50,000 in Europe. But in Korea, domestic adoption practices are actually quite small because there's still very much a tie for Korean families to carry on your bloodline, and to adopt a child who's not related to you is still not very typical. It's definitely expanding, but it's still not very typical.
Okay, and is class kind of differentiated by family name, by the last name?
Yeah, well, in Korea, it's kind of confusing because there's so many Kims. There's so many Kims and there's so many Lees. So sometimes there is a differentiation, but not so much by last name, just because so many Koreans do share a similar last name. But absolutely, in terms of family line, there is definitely a class link to the family bloodline. So there are definitely class divisions, and there is, again, like if you were born into a lower class family, there is, this is what all Korean dramas are about. Korean dramas are often about like the poor daughter who is dating the rich, someone from a rich family, and how the family disapproves and will never allow them to marry. The class system is definitely still at play in Korea.
Okay, so do we have any other questions that you see, Joyce?
No, I don't. But this was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Can I ask you all a question?
Absolutely.
Did anyone ever hear about the Korean Children's Choir, or like the World Vision actually sponsored Korean orphan choirs in the 50s and in through the 60s and even into the 70s. So I was wondering if anyone remembered the Korean Orphans Choir or the Kim Sisters.
I remember the Kim sisters.
I remember the Kim sisters.
Yeah.
Totally, Kim.
Did you see them on TV, or how do you remember?
I think so.
Absolutely.
Ed Sullivan.
Yeah.
Sullivan Show.
Back in those times, you see any Asian on TV, you get very excited.
Yeah.
True. That's so true,
Well,
Betty.
they both, Kims are both congresswomen too for us now.
Yeah. No, it's true. And then sometimes the Kim sisters, their mom would come and they would sing in like part Korean and also like part Korean and part English. So they would sing like Arirang, which is the Korean, national song. but they would mix in like, they would sing like they would sing the bossa nova, but they would say like Annyeong hashimnika, which is like hello in Korean. This is the Korean bossa nova. And so they did this like mashup of Korean and English and Brazilian, and they were these like really cosmopolitan, people. But I imagine that to see them in the 50s and 60s on TV must have been really exciting.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm excited by it now. I think that it's so cool that they did that, Thank you so much for your questions. Thank you very much for inviting me, Janice. Thank you, everyone.